Should we wait for a
Excellent.
couple of more attendees to join in?
Sure. Maybe give ourselves another minute, but thanks to
Sure.
those that are streaming in, and we can get started.
So we have about 10. Okay, so maybe we can start with a round of introduction and then get started with our presentation. Over to you, Deepa.
Yeah, thanks, Zeba. I just want to, thanks everyone for joining us on the webinar as part of the Global Evaluation Week on Measuring What Matters. My name is Deepa Karthykeyan. I'm co-founder, partner, Athena Infonomics. Really excited to be talking about or thinking about this because, gosh, the times, right? I mean, perhaps and I'll sort of serve as the moderator for today's discussion, but before we dive into sort of today's presentations, I think just some opening remarks. When thinking about artificial intelligence in general, I've found more recently that it's sometimes easier to start with all the things that we don't know rather than what we do know, right? So um, and I think that there's also some level of acceptance that there is a lot that we will never know, at least at the moment. For instance, we don't know the design or the training models, or we cannot explain why a model drifts or behaves differently on the same population at a different period in time. So there are a lot of unknowns, and there is a black box that we haven't fully unraveled, but that hasn't fully unraveled, and that we don't know a lot about. But what are we then talking about, right? Becomes the question. So when we think about evaluating AI, what is it that we're often talking about? We're still asking a very important question, right? Which is this doing what it was supposed to do, right? What was the goal or the intent? And when applied in a development context for a specific population at a specific moment, is it delivering the intended value? And I think that is still a very valuable question that I think evaluations can still do a very credible job of addressing. But where does it as an organization, as a team, and some of our lived experience, and we have experts, Aditi, like you on the panel today, is sort of this question of then what is it that as development evaluators, we need to unlearn or relearn when we're evaluating AI interventions against traditional evaluations that we've historically engaged with. And I think it raises some really interesting points, right? Because firstly, AI feels a lot less stationary than a lot of other interventions. So some of the traditional ways of thinking about baselines, midlines, endlines immediately become less relevant in terms of AI and AI interventions. They also are adaptive. They change as they adapt, and as you engage, every user can go on a certain journey of how they leverage. So when we think about traditional treatment effects in MEL frameworks, we suddenly start those treatment effects start becoming thinner. How do you start thinking about treatment and control when AI interventions in by design are highly adaptive, right? So there are sort of really interesting aspects to how you evaluate a advisory chatbot that's built for a farmer or an algorithm that decides cash transfers that's AI enabled, that's inherently distinct from how we think about, for example, an intervention around midday meal programs to improve school enrollments. So I think, and that's really going to be the focus of today's discussion. We have a really interesting panel, I think colleagues that I've had the privilege of journeying with. Uh, and Aditi, who's joining us, is an expert who's done a ton of work on AI for social impact. Brief introductions and a quick sort of how these discussions will play out today, and then I'll hand it off really for why several of you have joined us here to the presenters to share a little bit of their experience and perspectives. So we're joined today by Francis, Zeba, and Aditi. Francis is Senior Director for Global MEL at Athena Infonomics and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Hyderabad and has worked extensively on thinking about impact evaluation across sectors like health, agriculture, and governance. And most and more recently has been working on thinking about how we should evaluate for AI. Uh, Zeba is a senior consultant and holds an MPhil in sociology from the University of Delhi and has been specializing in thinking about questions of evidence synthesis, systematic reviews, and AI enabled evaluation. And Aditi is an independent expert on AI for social impact with over 2 decades of experience across the World Economic Forum, JPAL, at MIT, the Reserve Bank of India, the Innovation Hub, and PwC. So we have a really cool group of people. The structure for today's conversation, I think, is going to be we're going to have a set of presentations from the panelists that will set the stage for kind of their experience and perspectives, followed by which we're hoping to keep to maybe 45 minutes, and then sort of an interactive QA that'll follow a question sort of and I'm hoping to get questions. I'll serve as the moderator for today's discussion, and we are hoping to get questions in as we go into the Q&A phase of this discussion. With that, over to you, Francis or Ziba, whoever wants to kick us off with their presentation.
Sure. Thanks, Deepa, and thanks for that overview. I'm glad that you already positioned Athena's AI initiatives and the work that we're doing in this vertical. Before I begin explaining how exactly the AI framework for Athena came about, I'd like to also briefly touch upon what were some of our past works which have recently culminated, which have led to the development or us thinking about the relevance of this framework. Recently, myself, Francis, and a couple of other colleagues, we were working on a landscape analysis, which was around understanding the use of AI-enabled solutions within agriculture. The focus of this study was specifically within lower and middle income countries. As part of the gaps that emerged, some of the key or the core set of gaps that have been distilled right here in front of you are governance, evidence, and practitioner related gaps. That led us to thinking what exactly can we do as next step post this study. Of course, we wanted to demonstrate what are some of the key literature and evidence-based gap, but we also wanted to understand as an organization working in this sector and also in the sector of development and impact, what exactly can we do, which can be tangible enough and can be used by other organizations as well. And of course, developing an AI framework, which is broad, which can be generalized across different thematic areas and geographies was definitely a sensible next step. And that is what we have tried to co-author here. So in terms of the governance gap, I'd say that this study was seminal in terms of pointing us towards the right direction. What are some of the gaps or what are some of the limitations that the existing evidence has? What we realized through our rapid evidence review, as well as the state of the art that was part of this project that I just mentioned, is that there are a lot of very important global governance frameworks, such as OECD principle, the EU AI Act, the US External Security Act, etc., which do give us a very foundational grounding in terms of what a good framework regarding AI evaluation should be. However, these do, when we examined them closely, we did realize that they have a lot of compliance heavy sort of approach, and they do a lot of common risk management sort of an orientation. We also did realize that maybe they might fall a little short in terms of helping us address the contextual realities or the field realities across global south or across areas such as lower and middle income countries, which are often the focus areas of a lot of development projects. And we also realized that the regulatory capacity, the regulatory framework within lower and middle income countries was sparsely thought about, especially in the case of evaluating AI framework, evaluating AI interventions. And this being in mind, Athena developed or is trying to develop a very well-rounded framework, which is high level, but again, at the same time, as I mentioned, can be applied across different thematic areas, across different regions. And we're not trying to really replace the global governance framework. We're trying to draw inspiration from it. We're trying to draw some really good learnings and insight from them. But we're also trying to develop something that helps us build responsible AI. Again, when we talk about regional governance framework, we did a lot of case studies around Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. And these case studies pointed us to the fact that regional governance or national governance frameworks or policies are in place, but they might be a little too aspirational, sometimes also techno-centric and techno-optimistic, which is one reason why we wanted to have something as balanced as the framework that we're going to present, so that it is it sort of grounds itself in analyzing what is in place, how does it benefit people who are the end users of it, and it does not really limit itself to some limited set of data that can be drawn from a limited set of population, but it speaks to the larger population, the larger sort of group of people for whom these AI solutions are intended for. Uh, then further going on to the evidence gap, we looked at 51 peer-reviewed and gray literature studies that were part of our rapid evidence review, and also fed into our state-of-the-art report for this project. What we realized is that most of these AI interventions that we distilled were mostly in the R&D phase, and they were piloted and were definitely in a very nascent phase of their development. So we did see a critical gap between the stated AI potential of these interventions, these applications, and how they would fare in yeah. So we wanted to understand how these AI interventions would fare in, a field validated evidence of impact, and we wanted to understand how they would exactly sort of fare in a contextually relevant sort of a situation. And taken all of this together, the four pillars do not simply try to fill the evidence gap, but they're also trying to establish a robust evaluation infrastructure through which we can help scale up a rigorous, comparable, and equitable evidence base on the effectiveness of AI solutions, especially for groups that are the end users but might be left behind or might be in the periphery of, when we talk about the list of beneficiaries.
Yeah,
Another
Zeba,
thing
I
is
just
when we were
wanted
trying to
to, are
examine the
you,
use of AI within agriculture.
sorry, Zeba, are you sharing different slides or are you using the same slide as a reference?
I am using the same slide. I'm
Oh,
talking
you're
about the
using the, so
evidence
you, I was
gap
just
at the
wondering if
moment.
you
Yeah.
actually had a slide deck that you were talking through. Okay,
No,
sorry,
no,
please
no.
continue.
So, yeah,
Okay,
I'm talking about the evidence gap at the moment, and then I'll talk about practitioner gap. Yeah.
thanks.
So yeah, in terms of another evidence gap that we realized is that there are, especially in terms of the agriculture sector, smallholder agricultures or smallholder farmers, sorry, are the most populous or the most biggest chunk of users of these AI solutions. However, a lot of data that is being fed into these AI applications are being trained um, uh, on the large commercial farms or the large holder farmers. So these data or these models may not be asking the right kind of questions. And the framework that we've developed or we've tried to come up with, we want to ask the very targeted questions in this regard. And we want to ask, does this model work for the people that it is meant to serve? Rather than asking, does this model fare well in terms of the data that it is trained on? So these are some of the evidence related gaps that we sort of identified, and we wanted to have the components that speak to these gaps and they kind of fill these limitations in. In terms of the practitioner related gap, it keep it very short. And there's something that we identified here is that most of these global governance frameworks did not really speak to the practices of an evaluator. They were not really usable for an evaluator. They might give you a good grounding in terms of understanding of how an AI evaluation is supposed to be, or how it is supposed to be designed. But sometimes as an evaluator or a program manager, you might also require other checklists, other compliance list, wherein you're trying to understand what are some of the good, AI applications. With regards to this, Athena's framework was then built specifically to address this gap. Rather than presenting evaluators with a complex compliance checklist, which is drawn from an understanding of legal or technical standards, we wanted to ask some very direct yet simple questions, such as, does the AI actually work on field? Are the people it serves are genuinely at the center of this evaluation? Who benefits and by how much? And we're trying to examine some of these very nuanced and very layered sort of concepts. Um, yeah, so this is exactly at the heart of why this framework came about into existence, and why did we start developing this framework. We wanted to keep it simple, but also wanted to keep it relevant enough that it can be applied across sectors, applied across geographies. In addition to this, we also wanted to be in line with some of the existing global governance frameworks. As I said initially, we drew from it heavily, and we were also trying to adapt to them in terms of the context that Athena is working in. So firstly, we have the UNESCO Ethics of AI 2021, where we were trying to draw human-centered values, and this kind of formed the ethical bedrock for Athena's AI framework. We drew one of our pillars that Francis is going to talk about is human context validation, which requires end users to be participants in the process of developing any AI enabled tool. And we're trying to have it as a collaborative effort rather than having them as a recipient of something, let's say like an AI advisory or an AI enabled solution. We want to have a collaborative effort here. So which is why Athena operationalizes it for field conditions through structured feedback loops, which is very much at the heart of our framework. For the OECD AI principles, we took up pillars like technical accuracy, robustness, and red teaming and stress testing, which is, again, a very important component of our framework. And while OECD articulates robustness and accountability, Athena also provides evaluation methodology as a core part of this framework. And how do we try and embed a good evaluation methodology while also seeking key outcomes such as transparency, robustness, and accountability. Another thing that we drew from one of these frameworks was the US executive order that was developed and published in 2023. And we wanted to understand what is the importance of red teaming and stress testing, and how important is it to develop an AI-led solution or an AI-led evaluation, and what is the significance of red teaming, within this process. While the US executive order focused itself more on cybersecurity, national security, and defense, we drew from it, and we started embedding it within key developmental concerns such as food security, income, and livelihood. Again, we also drew from India's AI policy, AI for All, which was developed by Niti Aayog. And we were trying to closely sort of embed it within our efforts of the 4 pillars that we've come up with. And this kind of provides Athena's framework a practical tool for, looking for technical accuracy, human validation, impact attribution to any kind of AI-led solution that we are looking at. And it basically makes it more operational and verifiable rather than aspirationally stated framework or a document. So these are some of our insights, and these are some of the thoughts that kind of went behind developing this AI framework. I'd like to take a pause here and maybe request Dr. Francis to take us through the other components of this framework that will help you understand this better. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Zeba. Also, thanks, Deepa, for the introduction, and also like situating this like a discussion in like how Athena has been thinking about like evaluating like AI, and also like how the changing like field, like particularly different aspects of AI modeling is also informing the whole process. So Athena has been a learning partner for, like, for example, the AP government, and also like we've like done a systematic like review of like AI evaluations for FCDO. And throughout our interactions, like with different like AI model builders, like practitioners, government and foundation and other private sector like players involved in this, the 3 things actually stood out like for me. The first one is what exactly AI evaluations today. And then we have such a very like, well-developed evaluation practice in international development. What is that? The best practices that we have learned over the years in terms of very strong like experimental evaluations or experimental evaluations and several theory-based like evaluation models that we've developed that can inform the AI evaluations. And also, given that AI models also kind of come with very specific like features, like so for example, the speed in which like a version 2.0 could kind of come in, which is very different from international development programs that kind of run for like 5 years with very like minimal tweaking. So with that like features, like what are the new things that like evaluation should like adopt to? So these were some of the key questions that like we were kind of like grappling with. The first one, like what's evaluation AI evaluation today? Pretty much particular kind of looks into only the model like a performance, like it's called like performance assessment. Broadly kind of like looks at like whether the model like performs like what it actually like supposed to do. Like does it have like a really internal validity in terms of technical accuracy, like robustness, like a clarity, and also like testing for bias and so on. So that's what most of the model developers would look into. But what we kind of call for is to kind of like look beyond this model like accuracy like a test. Of course, this is absolutely critical that like technical accuracy is the floor. In a way, a model that really does not like adapt to like technical accuracy, like robustness, is not something that could be deployed in the real world. So we kind of treat that as a floor. But beyond that, is a technically accurate model is something that usable, is relevant. Would that really kind of like make a reasonable change in the lives of like people? It's a question that we ask. So that's where what we have learned in international development in terms of evaluation best practices kind of could come into play here. The first one of the key learnings in international development is like before we look into the impact of any development program, we look into the process in which it's implemented, like about the program itself, like how this is being implemented, how this is being received in the field, like by the people that who are the last mile like workers who are implementing this, and also the end users who like who are expected to kind of benefit from this. So that's one of the key lessons that we want AI evaluations kind of like look into. That's what the human context validation, the component of our like framework talks about. When we say an AI model developed for like farmers, like do we know like really how exactly these farmers understand this like AI models? Do we know how as like a last mile like worker let's say the extension worker understands this model, or does she like have like a right empowerment to override this model? So those are the questions that we would want to kind of ask in the human context like validation. And then going to, once we know that this is really kind of like working in the field, this is equitable, and this is also kind of like relevant to the context, then we actually ask the key questions like does it really like make does really change the outcome for the people? So in a way, like today, where the AI like interventions are, the third question, that impact question, is slightly kind of like far-fetched. We are kind of like looking at like mostly the model performance, and then are like going into the pilots. So this framework is actually kind of like asking for looking kind of beyond the model like performance. Then the fourth question is on something like very interesting, like that Deepa also kind of alluded to in the beginning. So how do we kind of like make sure that some of the like EI specific principles are brought into the evaluations? Like of like for example, like say most of our evaluations are testing for an average like case. But then, like say the edge case or outliers are generally assumed to be like a too few, or like something not sounds very significant for us to kind of get into. But then in the AI like models, like say a lot of these edge cases, like say for example, like poor connectivity like areas, or like a people with like say the poor like inputs, or like poor like a data like connectivity and so on. So these are actually the edge cases where most of the vulnerable population like sits, like say like women farmers, or like say like the most vulnerable group like poor people, or like people with like poor connectivity, are the one who's actually sit in the edge cases And that's where like we need to kind of really understand if these models are like working for them or not. So the red teaming is basically a question that are literally asking if the questions are all that actually like what matter to people in the edge cases are taken into consideration in every aspect of this model like development, like right from when we looked at like say the model internal like performance assessment to when we take this to the real world, are we really like testing for this edge cases is what this the framework is actually like looking for. And I'll stop there once like Aditi kind of like comes to kind of talk about like what are different types of frameworks out there, like what are the like best practices in terms of like AI like evaluation framework that like different people have like developed, like kind of we can kind of come back to like talk about or like what in India that like we could like do in terms of kind of developing like a framework or a hub for evaluating like AI. Thanks. And Deepa, back to you.
No, that's great. Aditi, please, over to you. We'd love to. We're excited to learn more about that and then happy to come in with just questions and just a
Yeah,
discussion after
no,
that.
absolutely. No, thanks. Thanks. This is a very compelling discussion. I just want to share, perhaps I was not prepared to share this, but if that's okay, I just want to share one
Oh,
slide
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
to really uh, yeah, talk about. So let me just give some context before I get into that slide. So why am I here? As Deepa mentioned, I have been actually looking at AI evaluation. Past few months I've been researching as an independent expert, collaborating with few foundations, Gates included, on looking at how AI evaluations is being done, given my past experience in both technology innovation, where I built softwares, I tested them, got them into real world settings, to working on in research policy settings. One of the things remained with me: how do we bridge this world? I mean, as Deepa mentioned, what you know of AI is very different. We are dealing with a very different beast. These are not stable systems. Things change very fast, and there is no baseline, midline, and end line. So you're constantly looking at a model which is performing varied behaviors under varied contextual situations. So how do you now look at evaluation approaches? So with that concept in mind, past few months I have been intently looking at AI evaluation approaches. I went about researching about what methods are being used, what is being tested, what is not being tested, where do we have resources, where do we not have resources, what are the gaps in the ecosystem with regards to this, and what are different organizations. So I spoke with 35 experts, organizations, individual experts, academias, center of excellences included, to understand how are they looking at this whole AI evaluation pipeline through the entire life cycle. And more often than not, when we talk about AI evaluation, people start thinking about impact and outcome. And while AI evaluation, as Zeba and Francis have also talked about, is not necessarily just at that level. So we are talking about an entire life cycle, right from the time AI is developed and put to use, and then producing what it is supposed to produce. So there were two concerns with which this study was taken. Of course, one, how do you redefine evaluation approaches? What is the new way? What are the new ways to do this? The second was the design question. What are the other factors that need to be put into evaluating AI? Because we are talking about data, we are talking about inclusion, we are talking about equity, we are talking about fairness. How do we bring this all? So just one slide to show you, what I felt were the ecosystem gaps. And if I could just, blow this screen. Are you able to see my screen and see the
Yes.
slide?
Yes.
Yeah, great,
Yes.
wonderful. So as we know, AI generally works through sort of a value chain, right? There is a model which produces some sort of a decision, and that decision is used by a user to change their behavior, and then that behavior actually then flows into sustained outcome or impact, right? So that's sort of a value chain that AI follows, right? Like there is a model which actually that goes into a product and then it changes user behavior and then it creates an impact. This is also a sort of a framework which has been produced earlier in consortia-based approaches by the agency fund, which is the model, product, user, and impact layers. I use this framework as a base framework to say what was missing and how the evaluation ecosystem right now is technically strong, but systematically it's incomplete because it's lacking integration across all of these layers. So what I found is that there are missing layers of evaluation beyond model. Model layer evaluation really often stops or more often is emphasized at the model layer, right? So people are evaluating AI models more than they are looking at the next few stages of how it is being put to use. Even at the model layer, what is really missing is that data standards and sourcing is not regulated and homogenized. There are no written guidance standards on what is the training data supposed to do, what are the checklists, what homogenized or non-homogenized sources of data can it refer to, so on and so forth. The model benchmarks are present, but they again lack comparability, right? Like you have different metrics. So there isn't a common metrics architecture out there which is talking the same language, the same lingo across different evaluators. And then there is lack of ability to understand how and why more than what. So the success factor is output. Has this model predicted something in a more accurate, more sensitive, more specific way, rather than understanding why is it giving different answers in different contexts, right? So that's one thing. The second layer, when we go into it, which is the product layer, where you are looking at a user AI user interface. Basically, you're looking at a product design. Again, there is high degree of information asymmetry. The design standards of what product design should be for different use cases, and what benchmarks should it actually look at is highly fragmented. Safety and design considerations seem to be an important factor, but they are vaguely understood. Specifically, the gender and the inclusion perspective is not very well thought of, right? People would design, and I've been through various ecosystems. I was with Reserve Bank, Innovation Hub, and various other, and we used to work with a lot of fintechs. And then there would be a lot of banks who would come up saying, we've developed this great AI agentic software, but they would actually completely miss the point that agent is supposed to work with male users and female users. Female users genuinely work with products in a different way than male users do. So there's a little bit of that sort of missing contextualization. There's limited contextual benchmarks for Indian languages, which is a huge sort of a breaking point for evaluating AI at that layer. There is a lot of effort now being done with a lot of organizations who are working on voice and language related benchmarks. But to begin with, there are global benchmarks, but the Indian ecosystem benchmarks are really poor. And then again, for the user and application level benchmarks as to if this product, which is supposed to actually work with ASHA workers or Anganwadi workers, or it is supposed to work with bank agents or frontline, what is the user adoption level that we should peg it against, considering this is an AI intervention? So there are a lot of there is a lot of absence of user and application level benchmarks. Coming to the user layer, I feel that the impact evaluations, which are actually looking at user and the impact layer to kind of aggregate the impact, they are, of course, they are slow, they are costly, they are not always feasible in all the use cases. There is a sort of an understanding that causal inference may be divided into social, economic, and technical evaluations. And so what are the different approaches? Again, adoption and behavioral outcomes remain poorly measured. So there is insufficient human AI behavioral change that is being measured through evaluations. Last but not the least, at the impact layer, there is also, as an ecosystem together, there is limited evaluation capacity, and also human in the loop evaluations are here to stay as a methodology. So how to build that capacity for human-centered evaluations. At what levels should you look at? Now LLM judges have come for automating AI evaluations. And if you do human evaluations, and if you don't do human evaluations, then you have to be very specific in your prompts, in your evaluation. So at that point, you need very well crafted problem statements, very well crafted use cases, for you to evaluate, for the LLM to evaluate the AI themselves. And last but not the least, there is no sort of a binding framework. So it's not that evaluation activity is not happening in the ecosystem. A lot of this activity is happening, but it is siloed effort. How do we kind of create a more holistic, more binding, more ecosystem driven evaluation framework, which people can talk and relate with each other in the same form of methodology, in same form of terminology, in same form of common metrics architecture, so on and so forth. So this really has been sort of my learning so far, from looking at what is happening in the ecosystem, what is missing, and what can be built. And I'm really glad to see that Athena is working towards at least filling some of these gaps and actualizing some of the pillars of evaluation that you have built in. But I do feel that there's a lot of work which needs to go into devising a very holistic evaluation framework, which then can be adopted and then can be also sort of spoken with and compared with each other as different organizations. So I'm going to stop here in interest of time.
No, this was awesome. Thanks a ton. Thank you, Zeba, Aditi, and Francis. Really, I think some really different, different sort of ways of, I think, Zeba, you brought up frameworks and how you were starting to think about a framework that makes sense, building on what's going on around the world. And a lot of it's been in the context of agriculture. Francis, you went on to describe that in greater detail. And Aditi, I loved how you brought the ecosystem view into this is so interesting. Can I, if I may just pick off from where you left off, Aditi, right? You talked about, let's just take the question of benchmarks, right? Benchmarks help us understand and compare models, right? Model A can perform significantly better than Model B on a set of benchmarks, but still not deliver impact on the ground or necessarily deliver the same set of intent. So, can we touch on maybe this is a good opportunity to start saying, okay, there's new jargon, there's new language, there's new ideas about what we do as evaluators that's come into the picture when artificial intelligence is being evaluated. But there are lots of things as evaluators we think about and work on that are still very relevant. So can we maybe start there? And I'd love to hear Aditi and Francis, maybe I can kick off with the both of you. As evaluators who've worked in sort of in the development evaluation space, right? Historically, what still applies? What are things that you still think need to be done that still stays or are relevant in the toolkit? And what are things that, and Aditi, you brought up some of this very beautifully, where the system or the ecosystems are still evolving, right? The systemic aspect of it is still evolving. So happy, maybe Francis, it'll be great to hear from you first, and Aditi, I'd love for you to come in because it's easy to go down because when in so many conversations, it's easy to go down, oh, we need benchmarks and we do, and it's relevant, but it still doesn't say anything about impact necessarily, or maybe not. I'm curious. Francis, over to you, and then Aditi on that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Deepa. Yeah, so like my approach to like kind of developing this like framework kind of came from exactly like the question that you've like raised. Like as an like evaluator, like what is that that we could like offer or like still kind of should keep what we've learned from international development. At the same time, like what is the new thing that we should be kind of learning like from like AI like models like as well. But just like the few reflections, like basically as an evaluator, like what would be the key takeaways like from this, or like what an evaluator should kind of keep in like mind when they start evaluating an AI program. For me, there are there's three things that like I would actually like always like recommend keeping in mind. The first one is have we really consulted like all the key like stakeholders in the system? That's something that we always do in the in the international development like evaluations, kind of keeping it like a participatory. Here, it actually like means the implementing the last mile like workers to the final like, end users to the experts and practitioners in the system. Like for example, in some of the case studies that like we did, the model accuracy was at 90%, but then when the experts were actually consulted, they said some of the outputs that or the advisory that the model kind of produces really does not make sense to the context in which like Telangana in which this was implemented. So a really technically a highly like rated model is not practically like implementable because that particular output was not available at all. Sorry, the input was not available at all. So like bringing in that perspective, that participatory perspective, or in a way that red teaming, that stress test, all the output at every stage is something absolutely like critical that evaluators should keep in mind. The second like key point is whether this been like tested for subgroups that Aditi also like talked about in detail, like particularly like say for like remote users, like low literacy like users and so on. And the edge cases that I talked about, like most of the vulnerable group that we would be really like, interested in are all like kind of could be like clubbed into the edge cases that needs to be like taken into consideration in the evaluations. And then the third one, the key important point again is like what is actually the plan for like when when the system like fails. Like so for example, when there is an advisory that is not like relevant in that particular context. So that's something in our work, like with like for example with the AP government, like we've been like talking about are the last mile workers are empowered enough to override the advisory that's coming from like AI layer. Even in another health related like evaluation, like we are kind of like looking into whether doctors versus like nurses or like other support staff. We are now like exploring are doctors more like a compliant or kind of override AI advisory versus like nurses. So that would kind of like give us an understanding into depending on a person's like standing in the hierarchy, are they taking AI as something that's above them or kind of like below them? Like a doctor might actually kind of look at AI as something not as experienced as like them. But then a nurse might actually think that like an AI is kind of coming with a lot more like data input in like with it, and that might actually give a better assessment than like her or his own. So that like the standing in the system, that's also something that needs to be like taken into like consideration. There's another one key point that like both Aditi and you also mentioned, Deepa, like about like baseline and also like some of the evaluations that we could do. In my opinion, the need for the baseline or like a need for like doing like I say 2 or 3 rounds of like data still remains. But what actually changes is the speed in which that we do. Like earlier, like we would actually like wait for the impact to set in. Like say maybe an immunization program or like a school feeding program, we would expect the impact to show up only a year from the end of the program or like 2 years from the end of the program. But now the impact actually can happen very quickly, or even like a small tweak in the model can actually like make changes in the way the program being adopted or like the results, so on. So the speed in which like we collect baseline and inline, how we collect that baseline and inline is what has changed. Like now with a lot of this information data coming from administrative like records, so like from the model logs as well, like now we really don't need to collect massive like field level like data. So the data input has actually changed, the speed in which the impact we could see has actually changed. Like evaluators need to adopt to that. Yeah, the
This
need
is
for
so
baseline
interesting.
states.
Thank you, Francis. And I want to just come in just and Aditi and maybe also have you weigh in on this because the two things I'm picking up is firstly, AI is changing the paradigm of impact, right? Of how the linkage, the causality or the causal chain is suddenly getting shorter or can get shorter if done well, which means you're no longer waiting for a lot. You no longer have need longitudinal data that you collect over long periods of time to actually say, oh, did the building of the toilet translate into a improved health impact, which where it does take time, right? Because but at the same time, there is something to be said about human behaviors and how they engage and adopt, which is sticky. So I'm not undermining that. But yes, I think there is something very exciting about that causality and the impact time frame, Francis, that you're bringing up, which then, and the second thing that Francis you're bringing up, which I think is very exciting, is that this, because every user is engaging with this and it's almost a continuous process. It's not a one-off event where it's, the construction of an asset or the provision of a subsidy. In my head, as I think of as a development professional, you often think of interventions as those stock items, as events that happen. While here it's a continuous engagement, a flow, right? So there is a dynamism about how somebody engages with an AI model. So where both the feedback, the guardrails, and also the ability to override or build caveats in is built into a far more dynamic system. Uh, and now you're looking at ways in which you can generate evidence and turn that back into value in systems where cultures of evidence-based decision making or feedback loops haven't existed historically, right? Like we're suddenly forcing ourselves to do things very, very differently. Aditi, I want to bring you in here, right? Like, what are some very practical considerations there, right? Like, because now there is then an over reliance of building evaluations into the technology systems that's delivering the intervention, as against thinking of it as a separate thing that happens less frequently. So, Aditi, I don't know if you had reflections on that and where we are in that journey.
Yeah, no, I think Francis really covered it all, and I completely agree with him on, and also with you, Deepa, that this the traditional methods are. It's not like we are debunking traditional methods, right? Like it's not completely. It's not a new wheel. It's the same wheel, perhaps with a lot more new features and perhaps a lot more cogs in the wheels to do a lot more things more rapidly, more faster. So definitely one of the things, and I was just looking at the framework that Athena has also developed. I almost feel that the red teaming pillar is actually an horizontal across your three
Uh-huh.
pillars, right?
Right.
It can't be a
Right.
pillar and saying, I'm doing red teaming, but actually not identifying what and where and when are you doing it, because it's not a stage wise process. It's almost episodic, right? Like you have weekly one red teaming effort which is going on. I mean, maybe weekly is too much, but what I'm trying to say, it's a continuous embedded AI evaluation practice that needs to be thought of. I think the ecosystem right now has to think of it, how can we do this without increasing the burden of evaluation, right? How
Yeah,
do we do this without increasing the
exactly.
cost of evaluation? Because why
Right.
do people deter or sort of hesitate from evaluations? Because it takes time, it takes effort, it takes money, it takes resources. And if AI was to be evaluated so very often, you obviously don't have that much resources to do so. So I guess the ecosystem right now is going to have to put their minds together to identify how to do this in the most optimized way, but making sure that it's definitely embedded in your evaluation pipeline and it's not a stage-wise process. Number one. Number two is that I do believe that causality and impact is definitely is here to stay. It's not going out. I think we are in a place where the model, product, and the user layers are going to take a lot more attention, because if that is right, impact will be right. Right. And very interestingly, what is happening is right now the ecosystem is rewarding building AI, building novel models, building novelty, as opposed to actually looking at even simple models doing the same thing but actually
Hmm.
helping change human behavior, right? So your model
Yes.
could give you the most accurate advice and tell the user to do XYZ, but the farmer says, I don't trust this machine telling me to do this. I'll do this what I have been doing because culturally this is the most impactful way that I know this will work. So those experiences are not getting captured. And so I feel that, as Francis said, I think process evaluation will become very important. And how do you feed those real world learnings back into the stage of model evaluation or a model layer, that would become very important. Those are the new things that you will add. I do feel, Deepa, that perhaps at some point, maybe not in a few years, but even in AI, use cases are different, right? Like some use cases are more deterministic than others, and therefore they do have a timeline at which point you can say, okay, they have kind of stabilized, and so can I look at impact study or longitudinal study? But not in every case. And I think right now, that's the whole point, that I'm also looking at a lot of research papers which are being produced by independent researchers who are saying that impact studies only look at economic or social evaluation, but they actually don't study human behavior change. They don't study
Yeah.
patient behavior change. So maybe we have to think together, so mixed methods evaluation is here to stay, a combination of different evaluation practices. Definitely benchmarking cannot act as a proxy to impact, right? Like you rightly said that an accurate response is not equivalent to an impact that has happened. So I guess we will have to invest more in the middle layers, which is the field implementation layers, the user intervention layers, the real world setting layers of evaluation. I think we are overemphasizing model evaluation, underemphasizing user application evaluation, and do not know what to do with impact evaluation. I think that's perhaps the right
It feels
place
like
that
we
we
should
are.
end the
Yeah.
webinar at this point, though, Aditi.
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, where do you go from there, right? But it's such a fascinating summary because it's so in a way, this is a call because I've now sort of been in several working groups and conversations where with the minute we start talking about AI evaluation, we talk about benchmarks, right? And
Yeah.
benchmarking dominates the whole discussion. And this call for process and impact, and what you're saying is, a we the practice of how to do process evaluations better in the context of AI interventions needs more attention, which means we need more methods and tools and toolkits that tell us how to do that better. And you're saying we need to get better at framing what impact means in the context of impact evaluations and look at behavior, which I think is as a critical outcome, and think of ways to measure that as a standardized shift, because this is so fascinating. I want to, and Zeba, one of the things that I was, as I was also listening in, as we're thinking about some of these questions, right, that Aditi and Francis have brought up, right, about what stays, what are we not paying enough attention to, but should be paying attention to. You talked about governance, and I want to, governance is sort of bigger, right? I want to kind of also draw that distinction, and evaluation often, and we can draw from that literature, but you sort of talked about the OECD frameworks or the AI Act in the EU and some of these governance frameworks and how you've borrowed from there as you're thinking about tools and toolkits for AI evaluators. Can you tell us a little bit, Zeba, about what you've had to keep, what you've had to just say, oh my God, this will never work in an India, for instance, or a Rwanda or a Bangladesh. Like this will never work in some of these contexts. And you brought up a important point of sort of regulatory maturity, right? And cultures of regulation. I think rather more than maturity, I would say cultures of regulation. We all have various ways and cultures of regulation that has worked depending on the markets and the ecosystems. So, Zeba, what can you throw light on what you've had to just dump and say this will never work and what you've had to keep in shaping the frameworks?
Sure. So, and thanks for that question. Yes, when we were looking at these frameworks, I mean, of course, there were some of the, indicators, some of the components which we thought that we have to build on it. What we definitely wanted to take up as it is was, the importance that was given to, human context validation. Aditi brought up human in the loop element to it, which is definitely central to all of our components. I mean, this is something that kind of runs across all of the pillars. There were certain, and there's this one point that I mentioned while I was presenting, is that none of these frameworks we at least thought was speaking to the requirements of an evaluator. We were talking about an overarching global framework, and we were talking about a lot of other things, policy makers and all of those things, but there is this need of, building something that is simplistic for somebody who's not a sector expert and can ask very directed and pointed questions as an evaluator, as a project manager, or as a program manager who is evaluating something related to AI for the first time or has just started to apprise themselves with this field. So we wanted to build something that is simple, and that is something that we had to definitely adapt to. Another thing that we thought was central, and I still feel that's very close and at the very core of our, development of this framework, is that how do we decide attribution? For instance, I mean, I keep going back to the ag AI study that I mentioned. When you're talking about uptake, let's say there is a particular application that is being downloaded X number of time. That uptake cannot be equivalent to engagement, and that engagement cannot also be equivalent to behavioral change or any kind of outcome that could be, relevant to, let's say, disaggregated group of owners, let's say women farmers, right? How do you attribute it to behavioral change? How do you attribute it to improved financial decision making or household income, right? So if you have a certain application that's being downloaded for whatever number of time, you do not know that it's leading to those kind of benefits. So we were cognizant enough of the fact that there are some really good, remarkable frameworks out there which are in place, and we need to, get motivation from them. But we also wanted to make sure, as you rightly said, that, there are certain things that do not work in the lower and middle income country context. There are certain things that do not work in the development sector context, and then there are certain things which have to be sector agnostic and have to be applied at par, whatever evaluation that you may be engaging in. So that kind of sums up how we, what we kept and what we adapted and what we had to sort of build right from the scratch. So yeah, that's the long and short of it. Yeah.
Yeah, this keeps taking us back to sort of this red teaming as a horizontal, right? Aditi and I keep struggling. How
Absolutely.
is there, I mean, what is a minimum viable or sort of a cost? Like, what's the version that you think today, right? If an evaluator went out in the field, what is what does red teaming the most what yeah can you what does a practical red teaming process as a horizontal look like, building off of that? I both Francis or Aditi, happy to hear from both of you on this. Yeah, and if
I
you
could
could talk about
start
the
that.
red teaming process, Francis, right? Like maybe unpack that for audiences who, yeah, just to
Yeah.
yeah, explain what that means, if it's a horizontal, and then yeah, how can we get it done, right? Just rather than talk about
Yeah.
it in these rooms.
Absolutely, Deepa. There is a real actually cost to like the red teaming, like both in terms of time and as well as like resources. So again, in a like resource poor environment, and or like in an environment where we really need to make the decisions very quickly to adapt to this changing like AI environment, this is very expensive. This is very costly. So proposing something which is not very viable is something would definitely not be like a taken up. So a red teaming, definitely that we need to look into like what is actually the minimum viable like version. Yeah, like for me there are again like three things that actually kind of like stands out. It's not like red teaming. Basically, actually, it's a question that you're asking. Like, does it really like work, or when it fails, like, what is your like solution? So the minimum common the minimum thing that a developer team could actually do is that the developer team, like the staff, could kind of like come in and ask really like a difficult question, not question at the edge. Like, so for example, you can actually provide extremely poor like a prompt to test whether your model really responding to like well, or like inadequate like a prompt to like look at like what's the advisory that you get, or like yeah, that try that extreme cases like yourself. That could be like a model that you want to try, which is actually the minimum that one could do. And then like see if the time and resources like allow, like bring in the end users. That would be probably the best like use of the poor like resources. And then the third like key point is it's not how much like we are like testing. It's how much we are reporting. That's something like very important. Like say like report like all the limitations. Like so, for example, if the model really does not respond to like a poor data setting, or like a poor like a prompt setting, or like say even like a certain like a dialects or like a different kind of like ways of actually like inputting really does not work. document all that. That's absolutely like critical, and do that in like every stage. So I'll stop there.
Aditi, do you want to comment? Thank you so much, Francis. Yeah, do you want to comment on this as well?
Yeah, I think as I said before, I said as in horizontal, and I know Francis did say so, because it is a costly process. There's no denying that, and there is the reason why we need to be thinking of how do we trigger AI evaluations more episodically, more continually. But as Francis said, I think you can define different stages, right? So I think the most important stage, and I say this in a lot of candidness and in a certain amount of humility, not to offend anyone, is that the problem definition stage. People are not able to define their AI intervention as a problem that they want to solve for. There's often a product which is built and circumvent on like, oh, we've built a model. But karna kya hai? That is really the issue, right? Like, so I do feel, and answering to your earlier question as well, a traditional method of theory of change and problem definition cannot be replaced. It's very important. So red teaming, stress testing at the problem definition stage is a very, very critical thing, according to me, as a traditional evaluator, I guess. And then of course, different stages. I think the data in the design stage is very important, because as Zeba also mentioned, you're talking about data governance, you're talking about data quality, you're talking about annotation, inclusion, all of those things. So I guess a lot of development is now happening on foundation models, and there was a very intriguing study that I went. So I feel in the AI evaluation space, AI safety and harm as an evaluation arm will become a very important aspect in your evaluations, right? Like
Yeah.
that is the most crucial aspect which will take place, because imagine you can lose a life to a poorly defined AI model, or inference taken by an AI thing. So I guess AI safety and harm will be a very important thing, and so therefore data and design stage stress testing is very, very important. Cultural language differences, cultural differences. I was at the Center for Responsible AI at IIT Madras, and they were talking about examples where farmers were using two different practices for exactly solving same problem, because culturally they were thought of doing something like this for the longest ever. So they said that our linguistic model, when we were testing them, we had to test them for those cultural sensitivities, because we know that a certain region of Tamil Nadu does something like this and a certain other region does something like that. So data and design stage is very, very important. Of course, the model development stage, where really that happens. I think one of the places, as I mentioned, how do you look at deployment stress testing and then feed? As Francis said, the developers need to work with the real life users and actually develop what users will do with those decisions, and how you can do usability testing, behavioral testing, and include that as the part of the stress testing. And of course, the general practices of doing at the deployment and monitoring stage. The problem really is that you're following all of these stages, but the model is changing very rapidly. So I guess we'll have to, together in an architecture or a framework, define what are the triggers of doing re-evaluation, and agree that these are the major triggers that needs to be mandated to do evaluation again, no matter where you are in the stage. So if your model updates, or your user context has changed, or there is so there needs to be agreed now new stage gates, which says if this happens in any life cycle of the development of AI, or deployment, or post deployment, you have to reevaluate, you have to retest, you have to do stress test. I think that would be a good identification of stages, and also will help reducing the burden of how regularly we should be do red teaming and stress testing.
Fascinating. I think this whole we got to do something with AI and the FOMO around wanting to work with AI without knowing what problem it's solving for is a really big part of, I think, the the challenge, and I'm really glad you brought up that the significance of the theory of change. And I really love this idea of like, what are the triggers for evaluation? So I mean, obviously, we could just geek out on that alone, right, for the rest of this web. But maybe the other, as I'm listening again, right, Aditi, Francis, and Zeba, right, this all does sound like really critical work that needs to be done because there are serious harms. But then I go back to the question of who has the incentives and the resources to do this, right? So there's the whole, we know it needs to be done. We're all very worried about the risks if it's not done well. We know doing it well, and we're all going to be sort of building a boat. We're going to be sailing a boat as we're building it in a way, right? Because Athena, for example, or our teams are going through an internal capacity building journey. We're learning on the job. And I don't want to pretend like, because we have a framework or we've done some work, we know how to solve for any of this. I think we're all figuring it out on the go. And this capacity building that's happening in the research spaces, there's regulators are learning how to do this. And we're going to have to start getting to the crux of it and start thinking about those questions very quickly, which is, okay, we're going to have standards and processes for model developers and sellers or service providers. We're going to have standards for governments that are building it into large scale programs, right? But if a corollary of that really in my head is, then who should be paying more attention to this that you think have more organic incentives and resources, but either aren't or are? And any reflections on, is it universities, is it governments, who should be who's in the driver's seat here a little bit when we think about incentives? uh, Aditi, maybe I'll start with you and then have and Francis and Zeva come in with reflections too. Aditi.
Yeah, no, there's no easy answer to this, Deepa, honestly. And you've said exactly what the ecosystem is going through. And I think we'll have to be patient to sort of have some, to seeing how this builds up, right? Because we are still getting to that place. And the most important piece, as I've been saying, and as a lot of evaluators face, we don't have Indian benchmarks. Like, theek hai, benchmarks are important, but we don't even have Indian contextual benchmarks. That is also getting built up, right? So we have to be
Yes.
patient. Those misgivings have to be taken into account. But I guess to your question, I think the incentives right now are rewarding more building AI than evaluating AI. That is true, right? Like, people are rewarding how good an AI it is. I also feel the incentives right now are misplaced in how scalable your model is instead of how contextually fit your model is. So this whole scalable AI model has become sort of a buzzword with at least the governments right now, and we really don't. I really don't feel that every model that is going to go out there has to be scaled, right? Some of them have to be contextually fit for the problem statement that they are trying to solve for, and which is why the most important thing that I said, that the problem statement framing and what you're trying to solve for is really important. And so I mean, who's going to solve this problem? Who's going to bell the cat? I don't think there is one easy answer, but I definitely feel that the government needs to give more emphasis to starting to require evaluations. I mean, it's almost like in a country like ours where we are innovating at a breakneck speed, we also need to make sure that there's the safety and the harm aspect is really well taken into account, because more than anything else, human lives are at stake, in different contexts. So I think government needs to start requiring evaluations, whether they are not full-blown evaluations. And again, I'm not caveating what does evaluation mean. Am I saying impact
Yeah.
evaluation? Am I saying no? But they need to ask: does your product work? How and where? And show me how. I think we also need to uh, uh, pay lesser rewards to publishing research papers to say we were able to do XYZ and get more media attention, as opposed to documenting more implementation learnings, right? Like that needs to be more important. If you are able to document and if you're able to feed in your real world learnings back at the model stage, and how, that remains my more of a question. Because I asked Gemini model creators, I said, as foundation models, you get so much intelligence on model getting changed. How do you feed that intelligence back into model foundation stages? So and even from framework operationalization point of view, right? Like a lot of good organizations like yourself and others are working on developing equity, fairness, gender inclusion standards and frameworks for AI evaluations. But I went back to one of them and I said, okay, great, this looks great. How do you operationalize it? How will you put this, make sure that this is done in the model, right? So that is the piece. Governments, regulators need to take their part in placing the right emphasis on evaluation. I feel also funders have a job here to give budgets for evaluations than just development. So I think the incentives can be sort of directed in the line, and I think good donors and funders are now opening up to this, and that's how even I'm doing this work for past few months and researching into it. Because one such organization also realized that we can't keep just giving grantees development funds. We need to also know whether it is creating the right impact. And very importantly, as you rightly said, I think shared evaluation infrastructure is a need,
Yes.
because it's going to be a cost and a burden. No one organization should be picking this cost and burden by themselves. So what will it take for us to build a shared evaluation infrastructure? I'm going
Yeah,
to stop there.
no, thanks. I mean, gosh, this is so, and I'm so glad because I think, and I've talked about okay, because there are so many critical points that you're making there, right? The first, and we're also raising some big, more tricky ones, right? Like incentives for researchers and universities to focus on illuminating practice and strengthening practice, as against just going after these ideas of what's the with what publication, what's the index value of a publication, and what publications am I getting my names on. And that's such a hardwired incentive for research. And I think research has such a big role to play, and universities have such a big role to play in building that shared evaluation infrastructure. So who's going to help shift those incentives, right? Like, how can universities rewire? Can we have deans starting to think about incentives and KPIs differently and appraisals differently? You bring up this whole question of like, and again, I've heard such interesting conversations with policymakers, because today it's also a geopolitical race, right? For all, and if India is going to be the use case capital of the world, we want as many applications to blossom. So I'd imagine in the foreseeable future, we're going to under-regulate on the model side, right? Like just from a political economy perspective, that's here to stay, I think. So which makes process and impact evaluations so much more important and significant, right? And we just need to figure out um, how do we elevate for governments the political risk of something going wrong, and building into budgets now being able to take caveats for large scale social impact, government sponsored or backed advisories or chatbots or algorithms, because then you are actively, I mean, there could, and you're perhaps exacerbating or multiplying harm because of one bad error. And then there is a piece to be said about who builds this evaluation eco infrastructure, right? The guardrails that we can all come and plug into, rather than any single private actor having to figure this out on their own. And is there a world where universities could become custodians of leading the way there? And because I don't think any private sector actor on their own is going to have the capacity or the resources to do it. I think it's really, really powerful. And Francis or Zeba, if you wanted to come in on that too, please. And then, yeah, we can, please go ahead.
A quick reflection on that, Deepa. Thanks. And yeah, in my opinion, there is no one single stakeholder who holds the key here. But I'll go back to the last point you made, Aditi, the shared resources. That's what actually like a really key here, because like different stakeholders are actually like solving different parts of the problem. For example, if I'm actually sitting in a large foundation or INGO or like a CSR organization, I get presented a lot of different AI models to solve the same problem. How do I pick between these models? or if I'm actually sitting like if I'm actually a senior like government bureaucrat, like I need to like pick a model which actually has the least like say the risk, because this is going to be implemented in the real world, like where billions of like say like farmers or like workers are kind of going to be exposed to this. Even as a developer, I will have to kind of like present by my model assessment evaluation to different like say users could be like foundations are like a government. So different users have like different needs like for evaluations. But what we actually like need is a hub or like a group like that brings in university like researchers, like evaluators, like practitioners, and then that needs to be kind of treated as a public good, that's a shared resources that Aditi was actually like talking about, and that could be like funded say initially like as a public good by like a few like large like foundations, and then like you should be able to fund itself like through like evaluations through the resources that set aside for just not like model development but for the evaluation. But that to kind of like a pickup like the first initial like few years, this shared resources will have to be funded as a public good.
Lovely. Zeba, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think Aditi and Francis did cover it really well. The only point that I'd like to make here is that, of course, we've identified the stakeholders, we've identified the shared resource problem. We should also identify, or we should also call out the fact that, while we're doing all of this, evaluating AI interventions, the focus should also be to ensure that, people who are at the most disenfranchised or the most marginalized communities that we are trying to address, they are not left out when we're trying to be inclusive, when we're trying to have an inclusive design. We should make sure that, because of the limitations of any AI intervention, the benefits of those end users are not left out. So I think I completely agree with whatever points that Aditi and Francis alluded to. Just that one final thought, maybe. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for keeping us accountable on that dimension of equity and inclusion. Zeba, I oh, sorry. Oh, Francis, I didn't know what the format is. Do we want audience? Are there questions from the audience side that you want to just unmute and raise? Sorry. Here, feel free to
Yeah,
raise your hand, and I'm happy
we
to
do
bring
have
you
some
in.
time for Q&A, so maybe people can come in.
I'm happy to keep the conversation flowing. If somebody has a question, please feel free to raise your hand and come in with a question. Sorry, I wasn't sure what the exact, I was assuming that this is going to be folks just raising hands or coming in with questions in the chat format. So happy to get in questions. So we're kind of looking out sort of 3 years from now, and we say, will the gap between AI sort of, the AI deployment and AI evaluation, is that going to widen, or are we going to narrow the gap? Because we know there's a gap today, there's a significant gap. What would you take a bet on or what would you say needs to happen for it to narrow rather than widen? Like what are the big ecosystem wins? Because I have like one ecosystem question and I have a very practical question for those who are joining here who are evaluators. But maybe Francis, I'll kick off with you. What are our big bets for narrowing the gap between deployment and evaluation when we look ahead?
Let me start more optimistically, Deepa. We do have systems like say in our like health or education, we do have like evaluations or like the regulations like put in place. Like for example, like getting a drug out is actually a very, very long drawn out like process that needs to kind of like jump like multiple like hoops. So we are like we have successfully kind of like put in systems like this. But right now, like the pace at which the AI models are being like piloted, tested, implemented faster than the evaluations. But it's also the right time that we put in that like shared resources for evaluation, and also kind of bringing the human in the loop, because this also could be the time in which if we really don't narrow the gap, it could kind of continue to like widen, because there'll be a lot of investment made in the current like model that would kind of continue like with the path dependency. So that's where we need to like make sure that the shared resources are like put in place like right now.
Okay. Aditi, did you want to? What are the big bets? What do we need?
I love the question, Deepa. But as soon as you put it into from a bet making to what is the ideal scenario, that is where so
Okay. Well,
I'll still keep it at
what
a
would you bet on?
bet making more realistic scenario. I do. So the closest analogy to this is, you remember how cybersecurity really took shape in our ecosystem, like in early 2000s. Internet just blew over, AI systems blew over, and security was just keeping pace with it, right? So it took time for cybersecurity, security standards to come and keep pace with AI development. I feel very much so in a very realistic way. I do want to feel optimistic like Francis, but I feel realistically, development will outpace evaluation for few more years, because right now we are in a we are in the peak of the curve of evaluate of development, and so that has to stabilize. The ecosystem is still developing. Evaluation will be a little laggard because few things, as I said, we are still figuring out the frameworks, operationalization, how to bring it together. We are also, as Francis said, it's an elephant and seven blind men. We are all dealing with different parts of the elephant. We all need to take our blindfold together, come together to say, okay, this and this is the whole picture. I also feel that evaluation capacity building is growing to become an important area, right? So not only human evaluation, but how do you conduct AI evaluation? So AI evaluation capacity building is going to be I was saying it's going to be the next big business idea for people to also get funding and grants for, because it will become an important thing for the future, but not next 3 years. Realistically, I feel evaluation will still be lagging behind development, to be honest. But to related to your former question, if there are right incentives, then perhaps this can become sort of a steady growing practice because of the universities, because of the funders, because of the government playing the role. So yeah, that's going to be my answer.
Awesome. And sort of I mean, if there's one takeaway that you thought, just as a closing, for development evaluators who've never done an AI evaluation before, ever, and if they embark on their first evaluation of AI, what would you want them to remember from today's conversation? Like what is that recall? What are the two, three things you'd want them to remember from today's conversation if they've never done this before? Seba, let's kick off with you.
Sure. Great question. And I think one key takeaway would be definitely as an evaluator, our responsibility to report on accountability. If we are committing that a certain AI application does XYZ, then we are also aiming to evaluate that it actually does those XYZ that we've mentioned. As somebody during the discussion did point out, that at this point, deploying and developing AI solutions is outpacing the evaluation speed. And of course, AI, and the change and, the evolution is so rapid that there are too many numbers to deal with. But within that number, we also need to decipher that, there are some really important questions being asked, some very direct, very pertinent questions that are being asked. And we're not just looking at the incomplete story. We're keeping accountability at the very center of our evaluation, even though the methods might change, even the approaches might change, and, a routine impact evaluation methodology or a TOC approach may not apply when we're trying to evaluate an AI-led intervention. But then what does and should definitely remain at the heart of it is being accountable for what we committed and what we're sort of trying to deliver. So I think that would be my parting thought for today's session.
Accountability. I particularly say holding ourselves accountable is some of the hardest things, right? Francis?
Yeah, I would say make it participatory, like maybe performance assessment or like say evaluation in the real world, a human in the loop, or impact evaluation, or even red teaming. Make it participatory, and that's where the evaluations like contribution would actually kind of come in. Yeah.
Thanks, Francis. Aditi.
I'll just say very simply to a developer who's developing and looking at evaluation, that you're not evaluating the AI model alone. You're evaluating the socio-technical system that is embedding AI. So think from that angle. So if there was one takeaway from this entire discussion, we all are trying to say this is not just model evaluation. This is not just technical evaluation. It's a socio-technical system evaluation in which AI is embedded within. So go and be creative, I guess, and then do all the things that Zeba and Francis talked about.
Fantastic. So I just don't, that was a phenomenal, I enjoyed this discussion thoroughly. I'm so grateful, Francis, Aditi, and Zeba, for just inviting me to be a part of this conversation and moderate, because if I consider myself on the fringe of all of this, right? If there's anybody here, I'm not an evaluator. I don't come from that world firstly myself. I don't. So I've learned so much in this conversation, and I'm so excited, right, for what I think, of course, organizations like Athena, what we can do and contribute, but more importantly, just the trajectory that we're on, and kind of the if we're able to have these conversations alongside government and universities and raise some of the points that were raised today. And Aditi, what you really quite beautifully summarized in terms of context, right? Like when we start thinking about success, maybe we should start talking about context uh, rather than scale. So we're also changing the jargon of what success means, because we're focusing on where can you add value, and often that may not necessarily be because a model works for 700,000 people or a million or 10 million, but it may also be because this model is adding significantly more value for a specific community. So it can be small and agile and work for a particular context really well and add a lot of value. And that is something that I think is going to be new to government and governance. And I think we're all going to learn along the way on how to make this, how to embrace new ways of thinking about these questions, how to be comfortable with a new set of incentives. So it's a really interesting time. And I'm really glad that I could be a part of this conversation. And for those of you who persevered through 90 minutes and stayed on, really grateful for all of you, to all of you for joining us. I'm going to give back 3 minutes if that's okay. Thanks to the panel. Aditi, thank you. It's fantastic to have you. Francis and Zeba, thank you so much for your great insights. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Deepa,
Thanks,
Francis,
Deepa.
Zeba. Wonderful conversation. I echo all what Deepa said. Deepa, you weaved us all in so beautifully. So really enjoyed the 90 minutes. Didn't feel like 90 minutes. So thank you so much
Thank
for,
you.
yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye.